Great. Well, I hope everyone can see this. And so I'll go ahead and get started. Many thanks to my EPA and EPIC colleagues, and especially Ben and Paul for putting this together. I'm really thrilled with the opportunity to be here, and I'm super grateful for your interest in this overview of reporting and signage, how transparency and disclosure affect environmental compliance. So the scope and scale of information provision for environmental oversight has grown dramatically in recent decades. And in the broadest sense, information provision for the environment now comes in just an enormous number of different forms. Here are a few examples: advisories and warnings, pollution release registries like the toxic release inventories, product labeling schemes, name and shame or name and proclaim programs where individual facilities, for example, are listed as exemplary performers or consistently in non-compliance. Social comparisons where facilities' performance is compared to the performance of peer facilities, self-certification programs, and reporting and signage programs. So I'll talk about a few of those in more detail and a few in less detail, but fundamentally what I hope to do over the next 30 minutes or so, after that I hope to entertain your questions, is to give you a big picture sense about disclosure and transparency, then to follow up with some specifics about disclosure, signage, self-certification, and other transparency programs to enhance environmental compliance. I'll give some examples of successful environmental disclosure programs. And at the end, I'll talk about a disclosure program evaluation that I was involved in along with a colleague. And my hope is that'll give you a sense of the potential for partnerships in these areas, either ex post or ex ante, for local, state, and EPA colleagues on this call. If you're doing something innovative or thinking about doing something innovative, this will give you a flavor of some things that might be possible in terms of evaluation of whether the innovative program works or not. So let me start at really first principles. What is the idea of disclosure and transparency? At its very, very simplest level, the goal of disclosure and transparency is to help inform the public and to help the public report environmental problems. In addition, disclosure can leverage private market and legal forces either to complement traditional regulation or to replace traditional regulation. And then finally, transparency and disclosure tools can leverage economic psychology mechanisms and enhance compliance through psychological motivations for pro-social or beneficial, socially beneficial behaviors. So that's really the starting point of transparency and disclosure. One of the many reasons for the rapid increase in transparency and disclosure programs in all sorts of regulatory contexts, but especially the environment, is that it is commonly perceived that transparency and disclosure tools are inexpensive relative to traditional regulation. It is also commonly perceived that transparency and disclosure are quick and relatively easy to implement. There are some other potential advantages. Transparency may be appropriate, a disclosure program may be appropriate when regulatory authority is unresolved. So for example, regulatory authority around carbon dioxide emissions has been a contentious topic of conversation for a long time, and one approach that has been commonly used is mandatory reporting of greenhouse gas emissions, for example. It is also the case that disclosure programs can be appropriate and/or politically expedient when the socially desirable levels of pollution are unclear or controversial. Traditional regulatory approaches that, for example, either are technology-based or define some sort of emissions limit are helpful when there is reasonable agreement on where those limits perhaps should be implemented. In cases where those limits are unclear or controversial, an advantage of a disclosure or transparency program is it can really just essentially say, we inform the public, we inform private market and legal forces of the level of environmental harm, and we let these other actors decide sort of how important the outcomes may or may not be. It is also, of course, the case that transparency and disclosure can be quite flexible. Disclosure respects basic notions of the freedom of choice, which is very important in many regulatory contexts. And then finally, transparency can be targeted towards specific groups. The idea is that some at-risk populations may be especially susceptible to disclosed information, while other populations that are less concerned about these issues can basically go about their standard business. So again, my goal here is to start in the very broadest sense to tell you a little bit about why transparency and disclosure tools may be useful. A large social sciences literature suggests that information tools can impact performance and compliance outcomes. And indeed, there are a couple of ways that this may occur. The first is through facilities or a disclosure's expected costs and benefits. The other is through these psychological channels I mentioned. So disclosure might inform stakeholders about the sources and extent of environmental harm. So in this sense, disclosing pollution and compliance outcomes may affect facilities' own beliefs about their expected benefits and costs of their own pollution and compliance choices. And you can imagine lots of different ways this happens. One is that disclosure might leverage activists and community pressure outside of the regulatory environment. Disclosure might spur citizen complaints or citizen group monitoring, like river keepers. Disclosure programs might actually let employees of the regulated facilities know whether this is an environmentally friendly or less environmentally friendly facility, for example, and that may influence hiring, employee loyalty, etc. It may influence consumers' willingness to pay for products generated or produced by this organization. And it's increasingly the case that the evidence suggests that information disclosure can affect a facility or a firm's cost of capital. It is increasingly the case that it is thought that environmental risks have implications for firms' long-term financial viability, and as such, it can be more costly to raise capital if a firm is perceived as a bad environmental performer. The one other note here along expected cost and benefits, if a regulatory authority, including many of the agencies that the people on this call work for, if a regulatory authority issues a new transparency or disclosure program, that may affect facilities' beliefs about how serious the agency is about environmental issues. Additional innovative programs can spur attention to regulatory issues. So again, my goal here is to simply establish sort of first principles. Why might environmental transparency programs and transparency programs more broadly work? And the first is they can actually directly influence firms' perceptions of their costs and benefits, or regulated entities' perceptions of their costs and benefits. I mentioned that another possibility is through psychological channels. From both an organizational and an individual perspective, transparency and disclosure can serve important reminder and reassurance functions. So the act of simply being required to provide information about your own organization may prompt the disclosing organization or the disclosing individuals to believe and to just be reminded that, look, compliance matters. Environmental performance matters, and there are people out there that care about these things. The act of information provision can lead disclosures to believe that non-compliance or other socially undesirable behaviors might be detected. The basic notion is more attention to these issues mean that more people, not just regulators, may be aware of these issues, and that can have implications. And then finally, the act of disclosing itself can remind individuals that their organizations really value compliance and environmental performance and other outcomes. This notion of reminder and reassurance functions is loosely alluded to in the social psychology literature as a telltale heart effect. So if you've read the Poe story of the same name, that should ring a bell. I put a little figure here on the right side of this slide. This is a randomized controlled trial, did an experiment where a group of public health scholars did an experiment where they wanted to see if they could increase hand washing in hospitals. Obviously, this particular topic has taken on a renewed significance these days. And one of the things they did is they simply posted these signs next to all hand washing stations and hand sanitizing stations in the hospitals. And they found that treatment hospitals, those that received these posters, had an increase in hand washing compliance among doctors and nurses from around 50% to around 66%. So again, just simply reminding and reassuring folks about pro-social behavior can have relatively important implications. A second psychological challenge, again, might be loosely related to the psychological concepts of objective self-awareness. There's a lot of evidence that subtle cues of being watched increase socially beneficial behaviors in a laboratory and a field setting. I'll give you a couple of just quick sort of toy settings, but they're illustrative and help people understand the point I'm trying to make. It is the case that, for example, in field experiments that were randomly controlled, simply notifying people of their moral obligation to contribute to a newspaper box that is out in public where you can hold open the newspaper and grab your newspaper. Whether people pay appropriately for that increases quite dramatically with subtle cues about either being reminded of it's the moral or right thing to do, or in other cases, simple cues as like I've shown in this picture of just showing two eyes. This simple reminder of being watched can cause people to increase their contributions to these newspaper boxes, to office coffee pools, etc. The basic notion here is that what does this mean for disclosure? Well, disclosure and transparency programs that are about publicly admitting noncompliance or other undesirable behaviors could threaten decision makers' self-concepts as honest people working for honest organizations. So let me pause here for two reasons. One is to just ensure that there are no clarifying questions that have come in.
None yet.
Great. The other reason is I should perhaps give everyone a heads up that these slides are a bit busy. The goal is, if you're interested in these topics, you'll have the slides with some extra information to go back and reconsider after the talk, or you of course can reach out to me as well.
So there is a comment that came in from one of the organizers, David Hinden. He says, we also know that providing someone with new or better information by itself is often not a strong behavior change method. Perhaps the question is, under what circumstances will information with what other drives improve environmental performance?
Indeed. So, I hope to get to that in the next couple of slides. David, if I don't do so, please re-ask the question. So to follow up on David's question pretty much directly, to be effective, disclosed information or the act of disclosure may need to be new and novel, The information needs to be trusted and coming from a trusted source. And it needs to be salient. It needs to stand out from all the other information that we're all bombarded with on a daily basis. I'll just note that the concepts of limited attention and information overload are absolutely ubiquitous in modern society. I think we can all relate to that, especially if many of you, like me, are locked in your basement 24 hours a day. The notion of information overload, especially in these disclosure or electronic forms, is really hard to keep up with. The other thing I'll note is that according to political scientists, trust in public authorities has been declining fairly steadily over the last 4 decades. And so the question is to, the extent to which this information would be trusted, new and novel, or salient, or stand out from other information. Those are meaningful and real questions. I also want to note that there are circumstances in which transparency can be counterproductive. If stakeholders incorrectly estimate their risks or harm in the absence of information, transparency can be counterproductive. One easy example to wrap your head around here is suppose that a citizen stakeholder believes that the facility up the road from them is heavily polluted, and then they see during disclosure that that facility is perhaps not as polluting as others in the industry. They may indeed then pay less attention to these issues, and transparency can be counterproductive, providing incentives for facilities to consider reducing their environmental compliance. There are a number of psychological factors that can lead disclosure programs to generate unintended consequences. I note just a few here that are specific. There's what's often called the ostrich effect. So you surely have heard the story of an ostrich burying its head in the sand when it encounters dangerous or scary issues. There is some evidence that the ostrich effect is quite pronounced for transparency and disclosure programs that may involve risk to personal health that are scary. Something that's closely related is optimism bias. Again, when environmental risks and other risks are disclosed to populations, it is often the case that when those risks are scary, you find a lot of people responding by saying, oh yes, those are real concerns, but they will not happen to me. So before moving to Virginia, where I am now, I worked at Tulane University in New Orleans. And it was very, very common that people were consistently aware of approaching hurricanes, and even those in very low-lying areas would repeatedly say, even after Katrina, yes, I understand that there's a hurricane in the Gulf and it's extremely dangerous, but I rode out the last storm and I'm going to be fine in this one. And then finally, an issue that can lead, a psychological issue that can lead disclosure programs to generate unintended consequences is commonly referred to as moral licensing. The basic idea here is that a discloser can essentially note that they have warned their stakeholders that they are polluting or that they are not complying. So I've warned key stakeholders that I'm not able to comply or that I'm polluting, and conditional on warning, I'm going to go ahead and actually be more aggressive in what I do because I've told everyone that I'm doing it anyway. And then finally, as I'll talk about in more detail in a few minutes, environmental information disclosure can increase incentives for concealment or at least strategic reporting. In a context outside of the environment, when financial disclosures were first introduced and became mandatory, there's compelling evidence that firms selectively chose to disclose good news and chose, even when required, to simply ignore reporting bad news. So I'll pause here.
Yes, there's a question from Paul Ferraro. Disclosure might increase incentives for strategic reporting, but that's not different from any intervention aimed at raising the cost of noncompliance. Is that right?
I think that's fair. Although I will say public disclosure has a component of actually making the disclosed numbers. If it's just about did you comply, et cetera, then I agree with that point. If it is about this is exactly how much I polluted in a given month, that may increase incentives relative to other types of programs. But the point is well taken. I will make that point very clearly that when we think about the empirical evidence on what we know and what we don't know, it is perhaps interesting and troubling that what we know and what we don't know rarely speaks to the advantages of disclosure and transparency relative to alternatives. We may know if it changes behavior and whether that behavior is consistent with the intended effect of the program. We typically don't know whether it's cost effective relative to alternatives. The last thing I just want to note is that transparency and disclosure can be hard. Disclosure is incredibly sensitive to small and sometimes even minute details in how that disclosure is framed and designed. Social norms, how other people respond to information, influences how I might respond to information. Disclosure outcomes can vary dramatically across organizational structures from very small to very large organizations. And so the points I'm trying to make here is the typical presumption that is behind transparency and disclosure really growing so rapidly over the last 3 or 4 decades is that more information is always better. But it's worth noting that that assumption relies on or that premise relies on pretty strong assumptions about audiences, how they access, understand, how they trust, how they process information, and how disclosures themselves are influenced both psychologically and organizationally by the simple act of providing information. So before I get to some examples of more successful environmental transparency and disclosure programs, it's worth noting what the broader empirical evidence suggests. Despite the overwhelming prevalence of transparency and disclosure as a public policy tool or a regulatory tool in society, there are exceptions to this, but on average, they're pretty pessimistic results about corporate finance disclosure, campaign finance disclosure, medical malpractice disclosure, conflict of interest statements. The Homeland Security threat warnings appear to have had no meaningful impact on any outcomes. Emergency preparedness advisories can change behavior, but typically not in ways that would be consistent with policy advice. Environmental health hazard advisories also appear to change behavior, but again, they often spur overreactions and they often completely miss vulnerable populations. They're somewhat more mixed or I think more beneficial results on average for product labeling and warnings, for quasi-regulatory performance registries like the Toxic Release Inventory. However, it's important to note that the TRI itself may not be doing that. It's the fact that that's accompanied by highly processed and polished sort of reports of the best or worst polluters in an area. So the program itself seems to generate mixed results, but some processing of that information may have more favorable results. And along the lines of Paul's recent question, the empirical evidence is about effectiveness. The notion of when I use the phrase favorable, this still says quite little. This just says, did it achieve the outcome it set out to achieve? It says quite little about the cost effectiveness or the efficiency of disclosure and transparency relative to alternatives. The truth is the information there is relatively poorly known. One exception, I think, is that the literature also shows much more consistent, not universal, but more consistent and more favorable results for what I might call name and shame or name and proclaim programs. The goal here is for transparency and disclosure to leverage and complement formal regulation instead of replacing it. So the idea is there's still a formal regulatory system that involves all the standard interventions, compliance assistance, inspections, fines and penalties, etc. But then performance within that system is then disclosed to the more general public. Many of you have seen restaurant hygiene grade cards. There's some mixed evidence here, but on balance, it suggests that these changed behavior and may have produced beneficial health outcomes. In the before I get to the environmental context, one really striking and very compelling example of a very influential name and shame program, OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, instituted a program where they had press releases about severe health and safety violations. Those public press releases led to a truly remarkable, roughly 70% reduction in OSHA violations at peer facilities within 5 kilometers of the publicized facility. Those press releases led to smaller effects on compliance for facilities located further away, but the effects appear to have persisted up to 50 kilometers. There were fewer workplace injuries, and just to put that in context, this particular study asserts that OSHA would have had to conduct an additional 200 inspections in order to elicit the same improvement in compliance as sparked by a single press release for a severe violation. There are some other examples of effective name and shame programs, and here directly in the environmental context. The Clean Air Act watch list, which was implemented by OECA and several partner organizations, basically simply listed facility names on a watch list, and there was then a subsequent public release that was led by third-party NGOs initially, and a result by Mary Evans in 2016 shows that relative to a counterfactual, the probability of a violation at a facility that was on the Clean Air Watch list fell between 10 and 25 percentage points as a result of listing and public release. Another very similar example is just an example about violation reporting in environmental context. This one has been well studied and well documented and much discussed given its older publication date. But Lori Benir and Sheila Olmstead in 2008 investigated consumer confidence reports under the Safe Drinking Water Act. The basic idea is relatively large drinking water providers were required to notify their customers of a violation of the violations of MCLs or other drinking water contaminant limits. And they found that the larger water utilities that were required to mail these consumer confidence reports to consumers subsequently reduced total violations between 30 and 44% relative to a counterfactual, and they reduced their more severe health violations by 40 to 60%. I will note an important caveat here is there did appear to be increased evidence of strategic misreporting, or strategic reporting is that the increased incentives to not disclose all one's violations appear to have led to an increase in monitoring and reporting violations. So let me pause there, Ben. Are we still doing okay?
Yep, I don't see any additional questions.
Beautiful. So what about social comparisons as a compliance tool? The basic notion here is that you might disclose to a given facility how their environmental performance compares to other similar facilities in the state or whatever the region or whatever the regulatory jurisdiction is. There's a really nice new paper by Paul Ferraro, one of the organizers of this call, as well as Dietrich Earnhardt, that basically sent letters that compared wastewater treatment, a given wastewater treatment plant's performance to its peers. And I'm sorry that I produced a relatively crappy slide here. This is a case where these are typical compliance ratios where the vertical black line represents firms polluting pretty much on average what their limit is. And the idea is, where did this particular facility fall relative to others? If you look at the star, this particular facility, the information suggests 13% of all Kansas municipal facilities comply to a greater extent than your facility. Of course, you can interpret that any way you like. The way I would interpret that is this facility is really doing well relative to its peers. This peer comparison information, there are some caveats in this study as to many, but the peer comparisons, this was an incredibly well-designed and thoughtful experiment, reduced a common measure of discharges by about 9%.
We do have another question regarding the EPA watch list now. So Dave Hinden notes that the EPA stopped the watch list because it was viewed as too burdensome and we had little evidence on its effectiveness. And there could have been an unintended consequence that states became less likely to report Clean Air Act violations to the EPA for fear it would be on the watch list.
Those are all super fair points. It is absolutely the case that the evaluation came many years after the program ended. So that's important. In addition, not all endpoints were measured. I think if there is a takeaway from what I'm going to discuss, the takeaway is that disclosure programs are very tricky to get right. And so David's point about a strategic reporting, not just among facilities themselves, but potentially providing incentives for states to not fully interact with regulatory partners is absolutely completely legitimate. Again, I do want to note that my point here is to reiterate there are some programs that appear to achieve the results that they set out to achieve, but not all outcomes are measured. And these are certainly very fair observations. A common question I've received over the years is, what about self-certification as a compliance tool? Does requiring regulated sources to certify compliance affect their compliance? The truth here is we don't really have good information on this question yet. There's a literature on self-reported pollution data, but that's a little different. Facility self-audits, there's a really great literature on this as well. It's supportive of the idea that self-assessment can improve environmental performance, but it's not super clear if it was the process of self-study, the process of certifying to the regulator, or both driving outcomes. And I think the latter there is crucial to understanding certification. And this is a case where one might expect some of the psychological factors or other issues to backfire. Other cases that involve self-certification outside of the environment seem to suggest that moral licensing and costly concealment appear to be particularly important here. I'll pause for 1 second.
Yeah, we do have another question here. This is from Dan Klaus, who says, you mentioned restaurant health grades and inspections. I know those results are sometimes published in local news sites. A couple of years ago, I saw a Twitter bot that scraped a municipality's data and tweeted out bad violations. I've been thinking about this in the context of NPDES DMR reporting. What do you think the effectiveness of something like that would be? Essentially a bot that tweets out the worst DMR violations.
While it's certainly difficult to predict with any certainty any given program, which is why I'm going to make a strong pitch for building evaluation into innovative programs when I wrap up here. What I will say is the evidence does suggest that highly processed, highly salient, highly novel information is particularly likely to achieve desired endpoints. One of the things that I can say is another feature of particularly effective disclosure and transparency programs is information that is provided to individuals at a time and place where that information might be actionable. So I don't know that the typical Twitter follower would necessarily be receiving information at a time and place where that's actionable. Now, if they partnered with NGOs or an NGO came on scene and basically took those tweets and then packaged them and then translated that into particular actions, I would expect that to potentially be more influential. As I say, ex ante, we can't know anything for sure. I would suspect that that program would have at least some possibility of achieving changes in compliance and pollution, at least for the short run. But I'm speculating. So I'd like to wrap up with a brief discussion of signage as a compliance tool. And the reason I'm going to wrap up here is this is a project that I was involved in an evaluation, and it's going to highlight both some promise and perils of evaluation for innovative environmental programs with agency colleagues. And so the basic idea here is I think there's some practical lessons along the lines of what I've been discussing so far, but also some lessons about evaluation and partnerships between agencies and researchers. So the fundamental question here is, as an example, is do requirements that water polluters post signage containing, say, permit and contact information at discharge points influence compliance and emissions? Some years ago, colleagues from EPA's Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance introduced me to a mandatory signage program introduced in the decade between 2000 and 2010. They wondered if I had thoughts on its likely impact and if I had thoughts on how innovative programs like this might be evaluated. And they noted, or at least reminded me of Ohio's exceptional data availability and data quality in this context. So a postdoc and I thought, how might we evaluate a program like this? It's worth reiterating, and I think everybody listening to this is keenly aware of these things. It's hard to know for sure, even with an evaluation, whether a program achieved its goals or not, unless that evaluation is incredibly carefully designed. So it is often the case that a slate of environmental innovative programs come on at the same time. Those programs may be targeted in response to changing compliance, or they may be targeted to facilities that are actually changing their compliance in some way. It could be, we require this only at the worst facilities, or we're implementing this program because everything's going great and we're not going to implement other types of programs, so let's try some innovation. And of course, there are lots of other factors that influence pollution and compliance. So what we did is we collected some pre-existing data and we asked the question, could we explore a natural experiment? So what I mean here is we compared changes over time for facilities that had to get the Ohio signage, and we compared their outcomes before versus after relative to changes over time for a control group of facilities, which is typically otherwise similar facilities in other states that didn't require the signage at that time. And then, so that was just a first order change, looking at before and after facilities that had to get the new signage in Ohio, and we looked at changes for those facilities relative to changes over time for control facilities in other states without this program. But then we exploited an institutional quirk of the program. It turns out that signage is only mandatory when your NPDES permit is renewed, and individual facilities permit renewals tend to occur on, say, 5-year cycles, subject to some idiosyncratic administrative backlogs and other features. But the basic idea is when a given facility comes up for permit renewal is quasi-random. And so the basic idea is we exploit an institutional quirk, and what we did is we compared pollution and compliance before versus after the effective date for facilities that had to put up the signs, after netting out before versus after for that same program date for similar facilities in control states. Then to do a better job, we said, what are the effects of having a new permit issued that now requires the signage for this exact facility relative to the exact same change for similar facilities outside of Ohio that didn't get the signage provision in their new permit status change. And then finally, we looked at the effects of a permit status change that triggered a signage requirement for a very specific facility. We looked at the before versus after for that facility relative to the before versus after permit change for similar facilities in other states and for similar facilities also within Ohio that did not have a change in their permit status and were thus not obligated to install the sign at that time. It's worthwhile noting that this evaluation used data that was fully available and collected entirely for other purposes. We used Clean Water Act data on facility characteristics, DMR data and limits for 2 conventional water pollutants, permit event information, and inspections and enforcement action. We collected supplemental data on local demographics and weather at the zip code level, and we did this for all majors in Region 5. And we found that, at least in a relatively short run, the violations for conventional water pollutants fell significantly relative to a counterfactual. And remarkably, the average BOD and TSS pollution discharges for facilities that were required to install signage fell by about 5% relative to their counterfactual predictions. So to just put these results in quick context, I know we're running short on time. These results do remain preliminary, and sort of thinking about the full well-being context of this is not feasible. It was beyond the scope of what we did. But it's worth noting that this program was super cheap. Direct implementation costs were low, probably less than $600 per facility. There appear to have been important changes in pollution and compliance. Regulatory impact analyses often apply social benefit estimates of, say, $3,000 to $2,000 per ton of conventional water pollutants like BOD or TSS avoided. And the implication is, again, this is not a full welfare comparison, but with virtually any assumption asserting that reducing water pollution is socially beneficial, these particular signage programs were likely to be cost effective relative to alternatives. But while this was an incredibly productive and fun product, an evaluation partnership that began before this innovative program was implemented would have been strongly preferable. This is always true. So you can have better two-way communication between researchers and agencies. Agencies get researchers' feedback on policy design and implementation ex ante. What do we know about what works and what doesn't? And agencies and researchers get much more credible results when they build an evaluation in ahead of time. And the results are typically faster. In this case, I'm convinced that a simple randomized controlled trial would have been faster, less expensive, and more reliable. And fair enough, I see the text chat about a simple RCT. No full evaluation that is credible is entirely easy, but I think if you have the right people and the right amount of cooperation, these absolutely can be done. And the idea here is that partnerships allow people with expertise to be involved in the design, the implementation, to make that evaluation far more credible and far easier than it might be otherwise. So if you're not familiar with randomized controlled trials, I stole this slide from Paul Ferraro. But the basic idea is this is just a case where you split a population into two random lots, and one gets an intervention and another does not. In this case, this particular slide was about a job training program. Those that got the intervention produced exactly the same results as a control group. And under these circumstances, with careful design, this program did not appear to be particularly effective, and therefore other innovative programs should perhaps be considered. Now, one common question that comes up is, well, how can we split facilities and not treat facilities identically? The truth of the matter is, when we run experiments and when we do evaluations and when we roll out programs in the real world, resources typically suggest that not everyone gets the intervention at the exact same time. You can absolutely exploit subtle differences in those interventions for outcomes. Please feel free to reach out if you have questions or concerns. I will post both my slides. I think these slides will end up on the website, but I'll also post a written information disclosure overview that has citations to basically every assertion in this slide deck in the next day or so on my website under the title information provision. So thank you.
Thanks, Jay. There isn't a pending question, but there was a bit more chat about Dan's suggestion for the tweeting about DMR violations. And Paul Ferraro noted that that would lend itself pretty well to random assignment, both in the tweet, whether anything gets tweeted at all, and also maybe whether someone is tagged in the tweet, so whether you're tweeting at a particular NGO, and Dan seems to be on board for that. And also thinking about whether NGOs would eventually follow such an account and kind of put, yeah, so I'll leave it. Do you have any reactions to that?
No, the short answer is I think those insights are absolutely spot on. There are a number of circumstances where this is more likely to produce changes in behavior, and I think that conversation has highlighted several of them.
So we have another question here. Is there any evidence on the effects of disclosure interventions on activities that are currently unregulated? For example, carbon emissions or chemicals not on any regulatory list?
There are. However, the majority of those, the evaluations are on voluntary disclosure programs. One feature of effective disclosure is that it's typically mandatory. When it's voluntary, you tend to get selection where the better performing facilities select into disclosing. And then in addition, voluntary programs have enormous problems, not just in terms of selection of facilities, but you also find a very selective information that's reported. The idea is it's often the case that facilities will report some very good things while hiding some less good things. In the cases of mandatory greenhouse gas and other reporting, there have been a few evaluations, and I'd be pleased to follow up on them. Whether they seem to have impacts remains an open question. That relates very, very closely to the very large literature on the toxic release inventory, since this is essentially a pollution registry, sort of in a broad sense. And again, the evidence there is mixed. In its raw form, there's some controversy as to how much that changed behavior and outcomes. However, in highly processed forms, of which the Twitter conversation has gotten us thinking about, there appears to be evidence that those have real potential and have actually changed outcomes in the real world.
I see another question from David Hinden, which is, if a new program will be rolled out over X number of years, assume you could roll it out in a phased way using an RCT design so that it's easier to learn if the new program really was effective. But this requires the government agency to give up some control in who gets the program innovation first. Do you have any thoughts on how to get around this hurdle? So I guess the tension is between control over who gets it first and the random assignment.
I think that's right. Do I have any thoughts? I'm sure there are people listening that are better suited to answer that question, perhaps including David himself. But I will just sort of evasively elude the question and say the following, which is, if you have compelling information about whether a program works or not before it is fully rolled out, that can radically improve efficiency and cost effectiveness of outcomes.
Another question from Catherine Dawes. TRI is relatively, in quotes, well explored. Are there other environmental data inventories that should be similarly explored?
That's a great question. I mean, my first order answer to that is the mandatory greenhouse gas reporting program for large facilities. I'm drawing a blank on very common other ones, but yeah, let me reflect on that, and please reach out. I'm sure I know the answer to this.
A question from Michelle McKeever. What about disclosures to specific audiences rather than to the general public? For example, within a certain sector, has anyone looked at the difference between targeted disclosure versus general disclosure?
Yes, the short answer is providing information where and when appropriate decision makers may use it to influence outcomes. For the psychological mechanisms driving potential transparency and disclosure outcomes, it doesn't necessarily matter who the user is, although you can make some arguments there. However, if this is about influencing the expected benefits and costs of environmental behavior and compliance choices, and I think many of these, the evidence suggests, really are based upon those responses. Yes, the audience matters a lot. And targeted transparency is much, much, much more effective than non-targeted transparency. The whipping boy of the literature is the terrorist threat level warnings. They used to be quite prominent, whereas threat level orange or threat level green or yellow that came to the public after 9/11. The basic idea there is that information is provided to the general public, but it's not clear what people should do with it, and it's not clear that the general public or the people that might actually do something about it are in a position to respond any differently under the circumstances. So consequently, the evidence suggests it had virtually no effects on outcomes. I think it's important to note that the literature does suggest that highly targeted transparency is likely to be much more effective than sort of general transparency and disclosure. All else equal.
As we come to a close here, I want to do a quick plug for the next webinar in the series, which will be September 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, with Michael Greenstone presenting on the potential for machine learning in environmental enforcement targeting. As always, you can check on the EPIC website for the contact link and the topic, the subject in advance. And we actually do have another question for Jay before we close out, which is, can you speak to the success or not of specific self-certification programs that require the publishing of emissions test data?
The short answer is it's my view that there's perhaps I'm misspeaking, but my understanding of the literature is that there's not a credible evaluation of that particular program, to my knowledge. So I don't know the answer. It would be a great answer to know.
All right. I want to thank all of the participants for attending and asking great questions, and the organizers, and especially Jay Shimshak for a great presentation. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you, Ben. I'm super grateful to all of you, and as I said, especially to Ben and the two Pauls and David. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Bye, everybody.